Si us sembla bé, i a ell li sembla bé, plantejarem aquesta xerrada a partir d'una sèrie d'oposicions que a mi em semblen importants i reveladores del que és l'escriptura d'aquest llibre. El Richard Sennett, clar que és un home que ha pensat la ciutat, però també és un antropòleg, també és un filòsof, també és un crític musical, també és un teòric del teatre, també és tantes coses que hi ha poques etiquetes que puguin abastar el recorregut que ens proposen aquest meravellós intèrpret. Jo que porto, no voldria ser pedant, però em sembla que dec portar més de 130 espectacles dirigits i que sentia que tenia un ofici molt ben consolidat, si més no a l'hora d'haver trobat una arquitectura de com jo m'enfronto al teatre, us he de dir que després d'aquesta lectura hi ha moltes coses que trontollen. I això és meravellós, perquè fer trontollar coses és una de les millors maneres d'avançar i de no quedar-se a casa mirant la televisió. Per començar per algun lloc. I per tant, a mi m'agradaria citar un element que almenys a mi em sembla que pot ordenar unes quantes coses d'una d'aquestes primeres tensions que m'agradaria proposar al Richard que en parléssim, que és la tensió entre art i ritual. És una tensió que està molt clara en el llibre del Richard i és que m'estava escoltant a mi mateix autotraduint-me i em sembla que no em cal. O potser sí, aneu a saber. Aquesta tensió entre art i ritual em porta a molts llocs. Un dels quals em sembla que és interessant és parlar d'una data que per mi és com mirífica, que és la data de 1563, on acaba aquell concili, el concili de Trento, que havia de ser un concili ecumènic, que havia de tornar a reunir la mirada d'aquells cristians que des de Roma se'ls deien protestants, l'etiqueta ja revela una determinada actituds, ells s'autoanomenaven reformistes, i aquella gent que havia quedat vinculada al papat. 1563, diuen molts teòrics del teatre que és una data clau per entendre el naixement del que anomenem el nostre teatre contemporani. Per què? Perquè allà es prohibeix les representacions religioses que havien donat un cert sentit o almenys estructurat una part molt important de la teatralitat al llarg de l'edat mitjana i al principi del Renaixement, que era el teatre religiós, el teatre que es feia dintre les esglésies. El Concili de Trento prohibirà les representacions de drames medievals a dintre les esglésies, drames medievals que tenien gairebé caràcter de vodevil a vegades, o sigui, no només eren elements teològics, sinó també eren elements que portaven una determinada teatralitat, i que allà naixerà com a conseqüència d'aquesta prohibició del que és el teatre dintre els espais religiosos el camí que ens porta als nostres teatres actuals. Un teatre on pots comprar una entrada amb una arquitectura determinada, cosa que el Richard també analitza amb un viatge d'una definició perfecta, evidentment amb els ressons que encara queden del teatre grec i del teatre llatí, que són uns determinats ressons, però que segurament el camí del Renaixement i del Barroc no els tindrà especialment en compte. I us he parlat de 1563 perquè un any abans, 1562, va néixer Lope de Vega. Aquí li devem el naixement segurament de la comèdia nova, i un any després, 1564, va néixer William Shakespeare. Aquí li devem el creixement de tot una gran tradició, segurament la més vinculada a allò que Harold Bloom anomenaria la creació de l'ànima humana o la creació dels elements que defineixen la natura humana. Pier Paolo Pasolini, el 1964, davant de l'estrena en el Teatro Stabile de Torino d'una de les seves poques obres representades en vida seva, malauradament, que era Orgia, va escriure un manifest per un teatre nou on ell defineix que el teatre ha nascut seguint uns determinats camins rituals. Uns camins rituals que servien als éssers humans per entendre la natura, per entendre Déu, per entendre la societat, per fer proselitisme del poder, etc., fins que es converteix, finalment, diu Pasolini, en un ritus metacultural. O sigui que segurament, 1964, la gent va al teatre, bàsicament, per desenvolupar o per aprofundir en el propi llenguatge teatral sense moltes altres subsidiarietats. La paraula és complicada i vosaltres m'heu entès. Crec que aquí hi ha un mecanisme clau a l'entorn d'analitzar el pas entre la ritualitat i com aquesta ritualitat esdevé art, esdevé, en el cas del teatre, art escènic. És un element que en l'obra del Richard l'he trobat espiculada al llarg de moltes pàgines i que em sembla que és un mecanisme clau per entendre una mica què li demanem encara avui com a societat al comportament artístic del teatre.
Well, first of all, may I, can I take this thing off? We are completely wired human beings here. May I say it's really a pleasure to be back at the CCCB. This was when I first started coming to Barcelona, this was a dream that people had, that there would be a center like this. And it's amazing how it's developed, largely thanks to Judith Carrera. I wish we had something like this in London, where I live. Let me, before coming to your question, let me just explain a little what this book is about. It has an autobiographical element to it. Since I began my adult life as a professional cellist, and then due to a hand accident had to become a sociologist, which, believe me, is an inferior profession. But I had always the sense of unfinished business with the relationship of the arts that I practiced to social life. And so now at the end of my life, I've sort of come back to interrogating that relationship. I've not been very happy reading people like Teodoro Adorno about music and culture, because it's very focused on composition rather than on performance. And in this book, I try to look at what does it mean to enact an expression, to make something that are just in music, just ink blots on a page, something that's living, just as you in the theater want to take something that is just words on a page and make it something else. The other thing I should tell you about this book, just as a general thing about this, is that it is the beginning of a trilogy, which I hope to live to finish, on sort of basic ways in which human beings express themselves to each other, the ways in which they arouse meaning rather than simply stated. So this is a book on performance, very much focused on nonverbal performance, on gesture, sound, the relationship between space and audiences and the public. The second volume is going to be about storytelling, and the third volume is going to be about imaging. How do we picture things? Now, those of you who are academics will know that this is a path that has already been tread by Walter Benjamin. And I make no apologies for the fact that I'm retreading that path in the steps of somebody who is a great, great innovator in thinking about expression, not about meaning as such, but about how meaning becomes expressed. So about this question of ritual and acting, I tell you a story now, which is also in the book, which opens it. During the 80s, many of my friends contracted AIDS, SIDA, as you would say, and there was a particular hospital in New York where they went to be treated and also to die. And among them was a group of actors who had performed various Shakespeare plays, but particularly As You Like It, comedy As You Like It. And these actors put on a performance in the hospital, many of them at the extremity of death from AIDS, of a presentation of As You'd Like It, which they had done together off-Broadway. So if you picture in your mind the scene of people who are professional actors who are dying, who give one last performance. And this is a Catholic hospital, which meant that there were priests coming in constantly to deal with people who administer the last rites and so on. What was amazing to me about this, and this bears in a practical way on what you're talking about, was that the actors refused ritual. They refused the last rites. They didn't want to see the priests. They wanted instead to act, to do something which was a statement, an expressive statement, which was outside their condition of being dying people, which didn't reflect who they were, but something about making an expression that was in itself meaningful, in a way that was not routine, that was transgressive, if you like, but which was certainly something that was unique to them as actors, rather as artists, rather than as dying gay. All of them were gay men. And that is always stuck in my mind. This happened in 1984, so a very long time ago. It always stuck in my mind as a kind of dramatization of the relationship between performance in art and performance of a ritual. That there is something about the performance of artistic performance which is not that it's transgressive of the ritual itself, but it's somewhere, it lives in a different zone, a zone of expression where things are unexpected, even with, just to give you an example of this, at the end of the famous speech of Jacques in As You Like It, about the 7 ages of man, the usual gesture is this, and these people who could barely raise their hands, they were so weak, would just raise a finger. It was incredibly moving to me. But I think it's also the kind of, it illustrates a big theme in my book, which is how do we rescue everyday gestures, whether they be in politics, everyday rituals, whether they be in politics or street rituals, so that they become something distinctive in themselves and have a value in themselves. And that's really what's one of the big themes in The Interpreter, how interpreters do that. To texts, we do the same thing in music all the time, you know. Normal ways of hearing, even if you go to a performance of a Haydn string quartet, which seems so normal, so smooth, Haydn is constantly deforming you a little way so that what you expect is not happening. There's something else happening. So that's how I've gotten into this relationship between theater and ritual in terms of enactment. I'm sorry to go on so long about this, but anyhow.
Una altra de les oposicions meravelloses que el Richard ens planteja és entre el llenguatge, la paraula i el llenguatge no verbal. A mi m'ha vingut molt al cap una imatge que faig servir a classe moltes vegades amb els alumnes d'interpretació, quan els dic que una part de l'essència de l'ofici de l'actor li devem a Leonardo da Vinci, quan en el seu tractat sobre la pintura diu l'objectiu de la pintura, almenys per Leonardo da Vinci, és capturar la llum. Però la llum no es veu. Com podem veure la llum en una pintura? Evidentment podem veure la llum a través de l'efecte de la llum sobre les coses, les cares, els arbres, els paisatges, una gerra, el que fos. L'objectiu de la gent de teatre moltes vegades hem cregut que és capturar una cosa difícil de definir, que és l'emoció humana. Però l'emoció humana no es veu, com ens va explicar molt clarament, i ho recorda Richard en el seu llibre, La paradoxa del comediant de Diderot, o els mètodes elaborats i complexes de les teories de Stanislavski, per exemple, quin recorregut és emblemàtic, tal com ens l'explica el Richard. Per tant, si no veiem l'emoció humana, què veiem? Veiem el comportament. I, per tant, el llenguatge no verbal, el gest, és el que acaba sent el veritable ambaixador de tot allò invisible de l'ànima humana que anomenem emoció. Us he de dir que a mi m'ha generat una certa perplexitat veure com el Richard en alguns moments diu que la veritable funció d'allò que Aristòtil va tipificar com la catarsi, la identificació amb l'altre, és infinitament més eficaç a través d'un gest, ens ho acaba de demostrar, aquest dit petit com medal de sida pot aixecar per suplir una altra cosa, que no pas moltes paraules que puguin crear un imaginari. Segurament l'espectador pot trobar una empatia molt més directa en aquelles coses que sent com a pròpies, que és el propi comportament, que no a través d'elaboracions textuals que a vegades poèticament poden ser complexes. El llibre comença, com ens acaba de dir, amb una cita del vostre gust de Shakespeare: el món és com un escenari, un topos que ja es produeix molt abans que Shakespeare l'escrigui, està en l'elogi de la follia d'Erasme de Rotterdam, o els nostres barrocs del segle d'or hi abunden molt amb la vida de Sueño o amb el Gran Teatro del Mundo, etc. Shakespeare, com a creador de l'ànima humana, ja comença a seguir aquest viatge, però el llibre acaba amb una preciosa anècdota molt commovedora del Norbert Elias, precisament un filòsof que va dir que el teatre era l'últim ritual cívic que ens quedava com a civilització, on el Norbert Elias se'n va a una taquillera del metro de Nova York i li pregunta per una adreça, i la taquillera del metro de Nova York, amb un anglès molt del Carib, li intenta explicar, i no sabem si el Norbert Elias, segons el Richard Sennett, l'entén o no l'entén, però es despedeixen amb una aixecada de barret i una petita reverència per part de la taquillera del metro. El comportament gestual pot arribar a generar unes empaties molt més profundes que moltes de les elucubracions poètiques. I aquest és un dels elements que penso que és clau en el llibre, com articular una de les altres grans tensions entre art i civilització.
You asked me such simple questions. I think we'll be here all night. Let me say about this that I will explain this very abstract presentation of this. But let me say about this that there is, particularly today, given people like Trump, who are superb actors, and but they're actors who are mobilizing very aggressive and destructive emotions in an audience. The antithesis between that kind of political acting, which basically legitimates something very uncivilized, and civilized behavior, is something that what stands in between them is the notion that, in my view, for civilized behavior, that there has to be a recognition that you are one among many, that you live in a complex world in which the things that seem familiar to you, you can't take for granted with other people. Now I will explain more simply the abstraction just presented to us. I knew Norbert Elias quite well, and and on this occasion, he's been terribly translated into English, and I had a very long and very drunken lunch with him, in which he complained about his English translators. And at the end of that, he had to go to take a subway somewhere else, and he was always dressed with a hat, things like that. And I took him to the subway, and he asked in not very good English, because he'd had too many whiskeys, the way to someplace, to a ticket taker who didn't speak English at all, a woman who was, I think she was Puerto Rican. And they miscommunicated. And he tried to speak to her in clearer English and just wasn't getting it. At a certain point, they recognized that they weren't communicating. He raised his hat to her and thanked her, even though she hadn't told him where to go, but just there was a recognition that that's the situation they were in, that they weren't communicating. And she smiled at him and said to him, "Gracias, thank you." It was a situation that, again, a little emblematic thing about a way in which performance of a nonverbal sort can be a kind of recognition of the other. And that's what our politics, particularly the politics of people like Trump, don't do. All this verbal language is about, all this nonverbal language like Trump's pointing finger, the dancing on stage and so on, is to create a bond with the audience that they understand each other, that they're one, and that they're not like other people, those horrible, woke, lefty, you can fill it in. It's quite a long list of enemies. But the point about this is that that's, for me, the contrast that theater makes between civility and non-civility. That on the one hand, it's a kind of affirmation of identity, and on the other hand, it's a way of affirming difference. Now, this may sound very fancy to you. It's something that every musician knows in a way. And it comes to little things like, we wear these concert tux things to perform on stage. And the reason we do that is to mark that this is something, we don't look like you, unless I've never played to an audience of people who were wearing concert tuxes. Might be very amusing, but that there's something different happening on stage. We ask people to be very silent for the same reason, that this is something which is not normal. It's not about us in rehearsal. It's not about you walking on the street, even whistling a tune. It's something where there is a difference that's established, and the difference is expressive. And that, to me, is a kind of moral, I don't like the word morals, but it's the ethics of how performance operates. Today, in the ascendant, is the notion of we're bonded, we're all the same. And that's with the political results that we are seeing in America, and I'm afraid we're going to see in Europe as well, again. The other hand is something that has to do a lot with cities, with the notion that in a city you're mixed in with lots of people. You don't know, you can't know who are strangers to you. And being expressive with them in these ways that are oftentimes reduced to just politesse, is a way of acknowledging the fact that you're living one among many, that you're living in difference. So that's another theme of the book. I have to say about this, I still occasionally perform, although I have terrible shoulder problems, which are due to bad training. But anyhow, what I hate in performing is to talk to people beforehand, to tell them what they're going to hear. I loathe the notion of making something like a Bartok quartet accessible. Not because I'm a snob, but because there's something about that encounter with something which is strange, which can't be explained, which just is, which is the essence of a certain kind of, I would say, very civilizing expression. In a museum, you know, when you see those long, long placards explaining to you everything about Picasso's, technique for painting that's on the wall, this is uncivilized. Do you know what I mean? If it just tells you by Picasso, that means that you're looking at something that may be strange, that's different. You have to make an effort to get across that barrier. And so it's not just a political difference, but there's the 19th century historian Jakob Burckhardt once used the phrase about modern life that it's afflicted with brutal simplifiers. And I think that's part of this whole distinction between civility and non-civility. So you put this much better and more abstractly than I have.
Us vaig a llegir un fragment extret directament del llibre, diu Richard Sennett, i crec que té molt a veure amb el que ens acaba de dir. Els buròcrates només viuen per les xifres de públic. Més que democràcia, aquesta visió és condescendent, com si la gent no pogués arribar a copsar l'art sense aquest embolcall. L'art, que és inherentment pertorbador o difícil, és impossible de pasteuritzar. Els administradors no entenen bé el públic. Hi ha una cita de Schiller, escrita el 1803, una mica abans que el Richard digués això, que diu: és fals dir que el públic disminueix el nivell de l'art. El públic només necessita ser receptiu i ho és. I això a mi em permet lligar amb unes altres dues frases que generen una controvèrsia especial que proposa el Richard, que diu que genera una tensió entre el saber allibera o el saber paralitza. El Richard ens parla de la seva experiència com a relator de les Nacions Unides davant del canvi climàtic i ens explica com aquesta experiència, generant una sèrie de documents que parlen de si no fem res, realment morirem, genera més una paralització de l'activitat dels humans que no un impuls per intentar canviar les coses. I em sembla que dintre de tot això hi ha una de les claus importants també del llibre, una clau que ens parla d'una manera o una altra, malgrat que la paraula jo no la recordo haver-la llegit directament, però és la necessitat de recuperar les utopies. En un món en el que sembla que les utopies han entrat pasteuritzades a les nostres neveres d'informació o a les biblioteques, però que estan absentes del present dels nostres dies, la necessitat d'encara trobar mecanismes de connexió social per canviar alguna cosa sembla que li puguem demanar només a l'art. Creus que això pot ser una lectura correcta del que tu hi dius sobre aquesta tensió entre alliberament o paralització?
I think if I understand what you're asking me. I mean, one of the things that any expression does, which has aesthetic value, is that it suggests that things are other, that it's not a confirmation, but it's rather a suggestion that there's something beyond. I don't know if that's utopia or not, but it's getting in that direction. You know this as a composer, that the notion of confirmation is boring. It bores people. It confirms something that they know already. And the problem with this is a problem in the audience, that they are willing to be exposed to something that doesn't confirm what they think. And that's, I'm not going to explain this climate change thing, although it's very tempting to do it. But these are like little rabbits that you're holding up to me. But the that's also a political function of art. And again, this is not just modernism. With people like Michelangelo, for instance, or Leonardo, even a better case of this, there's a suggestion of the play of light, which is not the play of light that you see walking around. That's why you look at it, you stare at it. The problem with this is how people can, an audience can want to do that. And here I think there's a great difference between where we are today and where we were in, our culture was, say, 300 years ago. In the 18th century, people were avid to hear things that were new. Very hard for us to, they didn't want to hear things they'd heard before. And this becomes particularly true when theaters open up to the general public rather than are confined as aristocratic entertainments. The taste, the middle class public, very hard for us to imagine this, was not astonish me, but I want to hear something that I haven't heard before. That's very hard for us to relate to. It's the assumption of arts administrators is that the art has to be conform to what people's everyday experience is like, so that there'll be an act of recognition. And in fact, an act of recognition can be a very different thing, that you're stimulated by something rather than confirmed by it. Again, this has a political side to it. I've been to, as I say, to these Trump rallies. The things that is interesting about it is that when he'll say something like, "Make America Great Again," they'll all chant along with him. What it means, who cares, you know? But the notion is that it's familiar, it's a confirmation. It's true in a more, so far, extreme way in Nazi rallies, which were scripted so that people knew exactly what was going to happen. But it doesn't need to be like that. And our ancestors in the 18th, and really in the Renaissance, going back as far as the Renaissance, but certainly in the 18th century, wanted from theater the stimulation of something that was unfamiliar. Can I say about this one of the things I wanted to say before, which is not an answer, a response to this question. One of the worst things that you mentioned, Stanislavski, who's a bête noire of mine. One of the worst things you can do in the training of any young artist is to tell them, you should feel it within you. It should come from within you. It should be an expression. What you express should be something that's deeply felt by you. The Diderot quote from The Paradox of Acting is that the more you do that, you'll do it once, but you'll never be able to tour. Because after 30 times, you know, your expression is all dried up. And there is something about the line between professional performers and amateurs is that the professional performer learns how to hold back him or herself or their self in order to be able to control an expression which time after time arouses the public. I guess that's why I wanted to say this at this point. The notion that, you know, because we're full of feeling, that we communicate that to feeling to other people is wrong. That's sort of romantic, not even romantic. It's a very amateur way of thinking about how all performance works. And what it's about, I mean, the whole Diderot paradox of acting is what do you do so that you can hold back and night after night elicit tears from somebody else where you're not crying yourself or you're crying artificially. What that also elicits is the notion that you are engaged as a performer in something where you are, in a certain sense, manipulating your audience in a way that you are not experiencing yourself. Very uncomfortable when to think about that. But there is a level of learning for a musician. We learn not how, you know, we give the appearance of being, you know, we're knocking it out. It's a double forte. You know, it's every note is detached and so on. In fact, you're listening to yourself all the time. More forte, little less double forte. And that element of calculation is something that I think is good for professionals. And it's just, it behooves the audience to understand that that's what we need to do, is be manipulative in a way by not feeling what we're making you feeling. Very, it sort of goes against a whole modern ethos of we're all sharing the same emotion. This is garbage, absolute garbage. Well, I'll give you one example of this. At the opening of the Brahms piano quartet, there's a huge octave that the piano plays, which is like, listen to this. And I've recorded it, I've rehearsed it many times with pianists. And they're always going, maybe I'll give it a little more. Or maybe they're feeling nothing. They're just listening to themselves make these double octaves and judging the effect. And that's the kind of calculation that it's so powerful to the audience that you're just, you're knocked back by this. The performer's just thinking, maybe a little more in the pinky of the left hand for that. So that's also an aspect that I try and look at in the book. And I'll tell you one more anecdote about this. I used to play, I was a very good friend of Roland Barthes. I knew him almost all of my adult life until he was struck down by a laundry truck. And we used to play piano four hands together. And I noticed a phenomenon with him that is also the mark between an amateur and a professional performer. whenever he was in technical difficulties, he'd begin to over-emote, as though by putting more passion into what he was playing, that he could overcome the technical difficulties he was expressing. And over the, I guess, 15, 20 years that we knew each other, whenever we played, I'd try to get him to a position where he wasn't afraid of making mistakes, of losing his place. And the more that happened with him, the more expressive he became. He didn't over-emote. It's something that actually expressed what the music is about. And that, again, is a kind of mark that separates professional performers from amateurs, which is the worry about expression is something that's very, I don't mean to put amateurs down, but it's something that deforms the notion of expression itself, which should become very naturally from a technique. You're not over-emoting. You're not shoving emotion into something. You're letting it happen. And how to engineer that so that you can, deal with things like forgetting. I have a terrible memory. I forget bars at a time and so on. Is part of this process that Diderot talks about of withdrawing a little so that the object itself comes forward. And that's also something I talk about in my book. This book could have been 3 times as long. When I read it now, I think, I should have done more about that, but it is what it is. So, but that's a very complicated thing to teach young children, how to not try and compensate for technique by emotion. And it's something, as I say with Bart, I saw regularly over the decades that we played piano 4 hands together. He's a terrible musician, dreadful musician, but a wonderful person and, of course, a great writer. And this was a theme of his writing about distance making. So I'm sorry to go on about this, but ask me something else.
Anem-hi. El Bernard Marie Coltés, un dramaturg francès que va morir el 89, un any terrible per les arts escèniques, perquè va morir, a part del Coltés, va morir Thomas Bernhard i va morir Samuel Beckett, 3 noms importants. Coltés en pocs anys, 40 i tants, mort terriblement perquè en aquell moment la SIDA encara no tenia els processos de curació o de no condemna mortal que tenim avui. El Bernard Marie Coltés va dir: m'agrada el teatre perquè és l'únic lloc del món on sé que tot el que hi passa és mentida. Però al mateix temps, tots sabem que perquè aquesta mentida funcioni hem de construir allò que un dramaturg americà, amb un llibre anomenat Escrits sobre els restaurants o una cosa així, ara no recordo el seu nom, deia: la veritat en el teatre ha de ser una veritat per ser representada, que no és exactament la mateixa que trobem en el carrer. En el teu llibre, Richard, tu parles de que la dissociació entre llenguatge i veritat té un moment clau de trencament que el situes en la Guerra Civil Espanyola. El seu pare i el seu oncle van ser membres de les brigades internacionals i transmets una mica la sensació que allà es produeix un dels camins dels que en som víctimes avui d'una forma molt clara, que és aquesta idea de la falsedat en els mitjans de comunicació, on realment la idea de que la notícia pot generar un espai de veritat per ser interpretada que no coincideix estrictament amb la realitat, sembla que ha sigut un dels elements que el teatre ha mal aportat a la política. Hi ha alguna cosa que sempre hem sentit, que en els nostres parlaments es diu a algun polític: no facis teatre o no facis el pallasso, en un sentit clarament pejoratiu del que és el teatre o del que és l'art de ser pallasso. Hi ha alguna cosa de que per molta gent encara el teatre és aquesta mentida però lluny de necessitar una creació poètica de la realitat, es queda només amb la suplantació i l'articulació de la falsedat.
Right. Well, this is another huge subject, which is the dramatization of authenticity, which is the way in which modern politics works. And every politician, left or right, is dramatizing basically the fact that they speak from the heart, that they're authentic. I'd vote for any politician who said, well, actually, I don't believe this, but it's the correct thing you should think about. But it's loathsome to me. That's a politician you should trust. Again, with Trump, that is a dramatization of authenticity. I really am mean. And that's appealing to people, you know. I really am aggressive. It's all right. This is really me. And the whole critique of authenticity, of course, it was a theme of the Frankfurt School. But to them, what they were thinking about was largely verbal ideology. Did this something truly represent the interests of the workers? What is curious, particularly curious about Adorno, who was a trained musician, was how indifferent they were to our world, to this world of performing. But that aside, there's quite a lot in what they talk about with this. We're hooked on politicians who sound sincere, you know? And that's a way of manipulating us, rather than saying, well, you're authentically awful. We say, oh, you're really speaking from the heart. It's a little what I was talking about before, that, performers learn how to hold back in order to make you feel that there's something real happening. But in political performance, that happens all the time. My own feeling about how to deal with this is that we need to have a much more active judgment among spectators of what they're seeing, that the spectator also needs to take distance from the stage. This was Brecht's idea. It's a very good idea, and particularly the age of these smartphones and social media, which are little stages in which you're largely passive. You're just looking at it, And particularly with things like TikTok, you're seeing little dramas being enacted. There's no way that somebody who has 600,000 followers is going to have a dialogue with any of those followers. And it's somehow we need to. I feel these phones should be destroyed. But anyhow, that's me. But we need to recover the kind of audience judgment of performance that is more likely face-to-face than it is on social media. And it's particularly, I don't know if it's true in Spain, but it's particularly true in Britain, where now about half of the young people, 17 to 25, would prefer to get rid of elections and the parliament and simply watch politics on their phones. This is a kind of self-slavery. So my idea about this is that somehow what's missing in my book is really, it's one of the things I should have added, is more of a discussion about how audiences become critical judges of the performances that they are witnessing, rather than succumb to the to enter into, as with the politics of authenticity, the nature of the performer themselves. And what I should say about this is that the contradiction in what I think is that as a musician, I want them to surrender. I don't want people to be going, oh God, he didn't really hit that A flat very well, did he? So that is a contradiction, and we live in contradiction. But that I think is for dealing with all of these political theater, we should be figuring out ways in which the audience comes back to an experience which is more face-to-face. And we're not there by any means yet. Do you have in Spain this notion of forbidding young people to bring smartphones into school? It's a wonderful first step to this. We're doing this in Britain as well, because they're addictive. The face-to-face of being in school is diminished because you're in this addictive technology, which is stupefying you, which is making you more passive. So that's the end of my political screed to you. Shall we ask people if they want questions or something like that?
I tant que sí. Hi ha alguna pregunta que voleu formular al Richard?
We have to see you. Don't be shy. There's one.
Jo veig una mà aixecada aquí al davant meu. No sé si algú li ha d'apropar un micròfon o formulem la pregunta directament. Un micròfon, doncs l'esperarem.
Hello. Thank you for the conversation. It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you a question, just following up on the topic, to both of you. Do you think that we are at the age of the spectators, of passively stepping versus the interaction of the messy interaction with the real world? Or how would you see our age?
I leave it to you.
Jo tinc la sensació de que de la mateixa manera que no hi ha un sol teatre, que n'hi ha molts, no hi ha un sol espectador, que n'hi ha molts. I tinc la sensació de que, afortunadament, en el llibre el Richard dona una xifra que m'ha deixat astorat, que parla de que hi ha 80.000 espectadors diaris en els teatres de Nova York en una època determinada. 80.000 espectadors diaris al teatre diferencien una enorme qualitat d'espectadors, una enorme heterogeneïtat. A Barcelona aquest any ens han dit les autoritats que s'han venut a l'entorn d'uns 3 milions d'entrades. I si analitzem una mica el paisatge del que s'ofereix en una ciutat com Barcelona teatral, veurem que l'heterogeneïtat és molt gran. Jo crec que hi ha una gran tensió, almenys en l'àmbit del Mediterrani sud, entre una determinada concepció d'allò que hauríem d'anomenar teatre públic i teatre privat. Són conceptes que, per exemple, a altres contextos culturals com Alemanya estan molt clarament diferenciats. El diner públic serveix per possibilitar teatre públic i no el diner públic serveix per financiar activitats especulatives sobre el teatre privat. Però això genera realment models de teatralitat molt diversos. D'una manera o una altra és bo que sigui així perquè quan anem al teatre a vegades hi anem com anem al McDonald's a menjar alguna cosa perquè ens han tancat el restaurant que ens agradaria anar i per tant abans d'anar-nos a dormir sense menjar res ens mengem una hamburguesa i no passa res. Però algun dia hem fet prou guardiola per anar a un restaurant de 3 estrelles Michelin perquè val la pena l'experiència. Jo, perdoneu que parli de mi, però de que haver vist milers de representacions teatrals i que m'hagin tocat profundament, potser n'hi ha 5 o 6 que m'hagin canviat de veritat. I aquestes les recordaré tota la vida, però són un tresor impagable. La resta formen part d'aquest ritus cultural al que al·ludia al principi, en el que anar al teatre és una forma també de conèixer llenguatge teatral, generacions d'intèrprets, singularitats d'aquests intèrprets, evolucions de la dramatúrgia, evolucions tècniques de l'escenografia o de la il·luminació, etc. Em sembla que el teatre, i aquí potser m'agradaria molt que el Richard es mullés, encara necessita aquella cosa que hi ha una frase seva en el llibre que a mi em retrunya encara, que diu, és una frase que cita la Hannah Arendt, Stadtluft macht frei. L'aire de la ciutat ens fa lliures. No? La ciutat com a espai de consensos, d'identitats que no busquen la singularització, que sinó busquen a l'espai d'interacció. La meravella del teatre és precisament que al costat nostre pot haver-hi una persona que aplaudeix igual que jo i que vota una cosa absolutament a les antípodes de mi. I per tant aquest espai de trobar cordialitat, de trobar respecte, de trobar una idea de que la societat és complexa, és arbitrària, és canviant, és modular, etc., però té un punt d'anclatge que és que encara necessita que l'art formi part de la seva respiració, és un tresor que hauríem de mirar de no perdre.
Sí.
Tell me a little more what you have in mind.
I have in mind, hola, señor Sennett. Quería recordarle su libro La corrosión del carácter, porque ahí está muy bien expresado el tema de la autenticidad en la ciudad y es medio una pregunta también, la anécdota de la señora que está en un bar y tiene un barrio y tiene amigos y decide estudiar y se convierte en una financiera de Wall Street. La autenticidad sería que ella vuelve al bar donde tenía un ambiente humano, o sea, usted sigue un hilo humanístico en todo su discurso ensayístico, donde también tenemos la teatralidad del yo, es decir, hay un juego de representación del yo en el restaurant-bar del barrio donde ella tiene el negocio, se desafía a sí misma a convertirse en un broker de Wall Street y reconoce que eso no es vida y vuelve a su negocio original, que era el restaurante. Ahí hay una representación de la autenticidad dentro de la ciudad, dividida espacialmente por roles también, no solo el rol psicológico, social, de no es lo mismo llevar un bar que triunfar en Wall Street, pero también es un rol de máscara porque son dos juegos de representación distintos. Y yo creo que usted está haciendo el mismo tema y me parece fantástico hablar de lo humanístico, que es lo que estamos perdiendo.
Yeah, now I understand what your question is. And this is a slight shift of subject, which is the role of performing in the kind of new capitalism. What's it like? When I wrote The Corrosion of Character, there was a kind of entrepreneurial, neoliberal character type just emerging in the so-called advanced economies, which were people who could dramatize, on the one hand, how cooperative they were with other people, and on the other hand, how unique they were, that they should be singled out, the one in 200 who is worthy of being promoted. And it was something that, I wrote that book quite a long time ago, that was just kind of emerging, that rather than a kind of bureaucratic structure that moved people through the labor force, that they had to perform at once that they were very cooperative, and on the other hand, that they were very unique. I didn't quite understand what the activities that would do that were like. In this book, I sort of returned to that because we now know what that world is like. It's a world in which basically there are too many people chasing after too few jobs. And so this is a survival technique to dramatize the fact that you're worthy of being chosen for these jobs, rather than a bureaucratic structure that allows you to carry on a career during the course of your life. And that it is a form of acting. It was first signaled, I talk about it in this book, by Herbert Marcuse. And it's central to his book, One-Dimensional Man. But it's about the notion that you're caught in a paradox, that in this new economy, there are very few places open. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And the problem is how to make yourself stand out. And that's kind of performativity. In this book, what I'm looking at more in the chapter on labor is what happens if you can't do that? What happens if you're an ordinary person who is just like other people and you're in an inability to dramatize yourself to your employers? And one of the consequences of that, going back to the discussion we had before, is that you become very subject to people who are able to dramatize their distinctness. You know, that's particularly with. I think that's a dynamic on the right, and on the far left too, but on the right, that people who fail to sort of stand out idolize people like Trump, who are distinctively unlike other people, you know? And that's where this negative politics of performance comes in. It's very hard, if you're young, it's very hard for you to imagine what it would be like, say, to be an office worker in 1980. You knew that if you put in your time, you did your work well and so on, you'd be promoted, you would have pension. There would be a reward for working. In this new economy, there is a reward for being unlike other people, an economic reward for differentiation. And most people will fail in that. How not? You can't have, if there's one job available and there are 200 wildly different people, there's no way to, that's not realistic. So I think that's the import of your question. Can I say about this that, I mean, to me, performing like storytelling or imaging is a tool that we use. It can be used well, it can be used destructively. And today, this tool of expression is used more destructively than it's used constructively. There were sort of prisoners in society of a theater which basically is destructive to human flourishing. And that doesn't mean we reject. It's part of our endowment as human beings to dramatize things. But we have to think very carefully about what use this tool is put to. And I think we haven't done that. We've been too, the fact of performing has become too important. It's odd for somebody who wrote a book about performing to say that. But you understand what I mean about this. Like any tool, it can be used badly, and we're using it badly today. So thank you for your question.
Sembla que tenim temps encara per una darrera pregunta.
If I'm given a glass of wine later, you can ask me other questions. Even Scotch, I don't know if you rent it.
Hi, here.
Where are you? Okay.
Here. Thank you very much for the conversation. I would like to go back to the fact that you were talking about that the performer should step back from their own feelings, be focused on the technique in order to make the audience feel, in a way to simplify. But I was wondering whether if on the field of modern music, such as not maybe jazz, but kind of pop and rock music, where authenticity is the basic tool for legitimacy, is already applying what you say.
What an interesting question. which I know nothing about. You know, just as a biographical thing, when I was in music conservatory, jazz, not to say popular music, was a forbidden subject to us. And I still, there are exceptions. I've learned to listen to jazz, but I know nothing about popular music. I understand that it's a kind of festival of shared performances. Music is so horrible to me. As I said, I'm not a snob, but I mean, it's just, the music is so boring that it's something I don't know anything about. I'm sorry. I know that's my limitation. We all have limits. So this is mine. If I could just say one thing about this, one popular performer I really like is somebody, somebody who actually has a harmonic sense. Is not very well known. She's a wonderful performer. But most classically trained musicians have this too. The music is so harmonically uninteresting that it's just hard to listen to. There's no surprise. Anyhow, don't get me started on this. Or you just tell me it's a limit. It is a limit.
Jo crec que el Richard contesta en el seu llibre amb un aspecte fascinant, que és quan analitza el vibrato del violoncel. L'origen del vibrato com a tècnica interpretativa del violoncel és un origen que no neix amb l'instrument i amb els instruments de corda. Al principi la música barroca no es vibrava, sinó que hi ha una evolució que es va produint a finals del XVIII i sobretot al llarg del segle XIX. Per què apareix el vibrato? Apareix el vibrato, i a mi m'agrada explicar-ho amb una paràfrasi actoral, precisament, amb una escola nacional que busca una veritat escènica, que és la francesa, que usa el vibrato glòtic. Quan sentim els actors francesos de la comèdia, sentim aquella vibració que nosaltres diem fer la cabreta, i ells diuen fer el vibrato glòtic. Per què neix això? Neix amb una dramatúrgia en què les emocions estan escrites per l'autor. Els autors francesos barrocs deien estic trist. No feien cas a Coltés quan li deia als seus estudiants de dramatúrgia no li facis dir mai a un personatge estic trist, fes-li dir me'n vaig a fer un vol. Racine i Corneille li feien dir als personatges estic trist, i els intèrprets buscaven una via precisament de singularització. I aquesta via de singularització ho he de fer de tal manera que no ho faci ningú més. Els intèrprets de prosa ho feien amb uns fiatos molt llargs perquè podien dir 14 alexandrins sense respirar i el públic aplaudia embogit, independentment de que comprenguessin o no comprenguessin el sentit d'aquells. Quan el Richard parla del vibrato, i que el descriu d'una forma admirable tècnicament i fisiològicament, jo he de dir que no en tenia ni idea, i quan ho he après dic ara entenc molt bé el procés del vibrato del violoncel, parla també d'això, parla de la capacitat última de la singularització de l'intèrpret sobre la música per ser alguna cosa pròpia. I aquesta cosa pròpia no vol dir que l'intèrpret hagi de passar per davant del discurs, sinó que d'alguna manera la connexió entre receptor i emissor ha de tenir una certa singularitat. Si no, ens acabarem posant tots la mateixa música amb la mateixa gravació en el mateix moment i segurament mentre fem una truita de patates.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, let me thank you very much for coming. I hope you read the book, and it's, as I say, so wonderful to be back in this wonderful and unique institution. And thank you for inviting me once more.